And I'm excited to lend my voice to our journey through Deuteronomy chapter 2. We're going to unpack some profound, totally practical lessons today. This isn't just dry ancient history, guys. It's a literal blueprint for anyone who's ever felt completely stalled in life. We're talking about God's timing, how he provides when you're in those really dry seasons, and why his boundaries are, believe it or not, a huge blessing. So let's jump right in. Right off the bat, let's get personal. Are you stuck in the wilderness? Seriously, take a second and think about it. Does your life right now feel like this frustrating, endless loop where literally nothing changes? You know, you're fighting the exact same struggles, asking these same unanswered questions, and just kind of wondering if progress is even a thing anymore? Well, for the Israelites, the journey was rarely a straight highway. And honestly, it's the exact same for us today. But here's the good news. Eventually, God breaks that cycle. After years of the Israelites just wandering in circles around Mount Seir, God steps in with a crystal clear command. You have skirted this mountain long enough, turn northward. It's a real game changer. It perfectly transitions them out of this agonizing season of waiting and into an action-packed season of movement. Because God knew exactly when their delay needed to start and exactly when it was time to wrap it up. All right, moving into section 1, the wilderness experience and the problem of feeling stuck. Think about the sheer length of the Israelites' waiting period for a moment. What was supposed to be a quick trip into the Promised Land turned into decades of wandering. 38 years is a really long time to avoid asking for directions. But why the huge delay? Well, back at Kadesh Barnea in year 1, an entire generation flat out refused to move forward. They let their fear of giants completely override their trust in God. And that one choice sparked a massive 38-year detour until they finally crossed the Valley of Zered. So we kind of need to reframe how we look at the wilderness. It wasn't God's ultimate destination for them, but it absolutely became his classroom. We often think of delays as punishments, right? But God actually uses these seasons for divine training. Human failure, like that disaster at Kadesh Barnea, never cancels out God's faithfulness. He is never, ever idle while we're in the waiting room. The crucial takeaway here is that during those difficult, dusty years out in the middle of nowhere, God was actively shaping a brand new generation. It was essentially a boot camp where they learned absolutely vital characteristics: dependence, obedience, humility, patience, and trust. What started out as a direct consequence of their parents' unbelief actually transformed into this profound place of personal and spiritual growth. Okay, let's jump to section 2, trusting God's perfect timing and the pivot in God's classroom. 38. It's a heavy number. It represents the painful, grueling years it took to finally get from that initial failure all the way to crossing the river Zered. But you know what? It proves something so important. God never wastes time. Yes, an entire generation of warriors had to pass away to fulfill God's judgment, but that same time was used to prepare a new generation capable of fulfilling his purpose. What felt like an endless, frustrating delay was really just the completion of a necessary cycle. And that brings us to the core truth of the whole wilderness experience. God's delay is not denial. Think about Abraham waiting decades for a promised son, or Joseph surviving years of slavery in prison before his big promotion, or David, who was anointed way before he ever actually wore the crown. It's a powerful reminder that even when your life feels completely stagnant, God is behind the scenes, working with absolute perfect wisdom. Let's keep moving. Section 3, divine boundaries and provision, and the rules of the road. There's a really fascinating contrast to look at here. The world's way is all about comparison, envy, and ruthless ambition, right? We're constantly tempted to measure our own success by looking at what the guy next to us has. But God's way is entirely different. As Israel got closer to the territories of Esau and Lot, God explicitly told them, hey, don't meddle here. Why? Because he hadn't given them that land. It was a strict call to respect boundaries and lean into contentment and trust. Basically, we aren't supposed to chase what God hasn't assigned to us. Have you ever felt like you are just walking in circles, but somehow you're still surviving? Deuteronomy 2:7 drops this beautiful reminder that even in the absolute harshest conditions, God's faithfulness ensures his people lack absolutely nothing they need. We see this echoing all throughout history. Think about Corrie ten Boom surviving a World War II concentration camp. Even in the deepest suffering and total uncertainty, God's provision and his presence just remain astoundingly constant. All right, moving into section 4, facing your giants and the inevitable conflict. So, Moses reminds the Israelites of this super interesting historical fact. Other nations had already faced massive giants and actually won. The descendants of Lot successfully kicked out the giant Emim and Zamzamim. And the big so what here is this. If God enabled those other nations to conquer their massive, terrifying giants, He can 100% equip you to overcome yours today. Whether it's a health crisis, a financial mountain, family drama, or just personal struggles, no obstacle is too big.
Which means we need to totally redefine our view of faith. Listen, faith does not deny the existence of giants. The giants are real. The struggles are very real. Faith simply refuses to place those giants above God. It's a mindset shift. Where human fear just sees a complete impossibility, spiritual faith looks at the exact same situation and sees an incredible opportunity for God's unbelievable power to show up.
And that brings us to section 5, moving forward in faith, focusing on resolution and action.
Here it is, the definitive call to action. After all that endless waiting, God finally tells His people, rise, take your journey, and cross over the river Arnon. It's basically Him saying, stop waiting, let's go. It was time to step into the promise He prepared for them. Because there's a season to wait, sure. There's a season to learn. But eventually, there is a season to pack up and move forward.
But pay attention to exactly how they moved forward. When they faced fierce opposition like King Sihon, they followed a very strict biblical protocol. First, they pursued peace. They literally asked for safe passage and offered to buy food. Second, when Sihon got stubborn and attacked, they stood their ground and fought courageously. And third, they respected boundaries. Even after this massive victory, they didn't touch the land of Ammon, simply because God said no. Having God's blessing doesn't suddenly cancel out our need for obedience. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought about your own spiritual journey. You've seen the preparation, the provision, and the exact protocol for facing giants. The question is, when your wilderness season finally ends and God clearly tells you to move forward, what are you going to do? Will you trust His timing and boldly step out in faith? Or will you just stay comfortable in the familiar dust of the wilderness? Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and definitely keep moving forward.